I don't have much to say except a word or two about these two presenters. Habtamu is a journalist by training. He was trained both in Ethiopia and South Africa, taught for some 5 years in Ethiopia. Is that the case in Oromia? About 8 years. And he completed graduate studies here, and he is now teaching at a university in in New York State. And he is an active member, has been an active member of OSA, and is really a young, very promising scholar. And the future of OSA is based on someone like him and then Kadiro.
Time is really very short. My name is Habtamu Dugo again. I don't want to reintroduce myself. This study was conducted at George Mason University as part of my graduate studies, Masters of Science in Conflict Analysis and Resolution. And the extended version of it is downloadable on George Mason University's website, and I can give you an abstract for it. I'm not going to present the entire study here. So the purpose of this study was to examine the inspirational role of U.S. intervention in domestic ethno-nationalist conflict in the Ethiopian empire. The purpose was also to understand why the U.S. has chosen the northern elites over southern elites. When I'm saying the northern elites, I'm talking about the Amhara then and then the Tigray now. When I'm talking about the south, I'm talking about the Oromos, the Ogaden, and the other oppressed nations in the south. So my argument is that intervention has favored and has been aligned with this group for a number of reasons. Again, the research question that this study sought to answer, the major one was, what are the justifications for choosing the Ethiopian elites-led authoritarian state as dependent US or Western ally while sidelining others, demanding inclusion and representation locally and internationally? As popularly believed by some members of the Ethiopian communities in the US, especially, everybody believes this, the US interventions contributed to domestic structural and direct violence, and if so, you know, how? I'm not going to run through all the questions, but it's a travesty of justice to see less than 6% of the country's population dominating 94 percent of the country's population and more than 40% of Oromo. So as you see, this is from the government's, the regime's own statistics. The number of Tigrays is 5.8%. Oromo is 36.7%. Amhara, you have 23.3% according to the 2000 statistics. So we're looking at it in this context. So first, I wanted to look at the actors, the major actors in the conflict. So the domestic actors and incompatible goals, the TPLF, or the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, is one of the actors. And its goal is to, initially it was to break off and form an independent Tigrayan Republic, but later on they reformed the goal and wanted to dominate the multinational empire under the guise of democracy, human rights, and other justifications. And the second other actors are the pro-Amhara, or the right-wing kind of radical actors. For example, Gimbot 7, it's interested in maintaining an Ethiopia dominated by Amhara and some people of Amhara persuasion like Birhanu Nagga and others. And the other major actors, the Oromo Liberation Front, interested in self-determination for the Oromo people. And the Ogaden Liberation Front is interested in self-determination or independence for the Ogaden people. So the South, which has been sidelined for close to a century and a decade, is the Oromo, and the Ogaden, the North, which has been supported by the United States and other Western donors, is the TPLF and other groups. Internationally, this conflict is very complicated. There are international proxy warriors involved. For example, the United States had a lot of reasons. One of the reasons is that in 1991 to 1996, there was OBL, or Osama bin Laden, in Sudan. And there were Soviets early before 1989. And then there was the Islamic Union Court, or the ICU, which morphed into Al-Shabaab now, and high-value target, or what they call it in terrorism language, HVTs. So these are what America is interested in, to control what it calls unfriendly forces in the Horn of Africa. Sometimes genuine extremist forces, terrorist forces, but the Oromo cause, the Ogaden cause, has nothing whatsoever to do with the OBL or the bombing of US embassies in Kenya or Tanzania. But what the elites in the TPLF, or the Tigray People's Liberation Front, are using is that they're using this terrorism dynamic to kind of sway support from both the United States, the EU, and other African nations. So this is a very complicated, multi-layered actors, multi-layered conflict. I'm not going to go into the methodology. I'm just going to go ahead. My theoretical framework was, unfortunately, we're supposed to develop a GADA model. I used realism to look at this, and the purpose of realism, especially offensive realism, is to be ahead of your enemy, to outcompete, to defeat, to control, to contain, or sometimes to eliminate. That Soviets or the US versus other, say, Al-Qaeda, those things are very, very realist focused. And also I use the theory of structural violence to look at the way the minority government has actually manipulated the language that is global to its own benefit. So the U.S. interest, the diplomatic relationship with the empire started officially in 1903 with the what is called, there was a program, the Point 4 program, and then it grew out of that and it started to get formalized during the Cold War, start in 1951. So basically, the first policy, actually it's written US policy towards Ethiopia, according to government archive that I looked at, is dated back to 1956. So starting from that time, fast forwarding, intervention has been justifying ethno-nationalist elites, and typically the elites from the north, to squash the people from the south. So US policy has been clearly militarized towards Ethiopia, partially because of the reasons that I mentioned. Somalia is there, Sudan, and there are other factors that are international. And our cause is caught up in this complexity. So for example, to cite in 1966, in the struggle between the leftist movement and the Haile Selassie government, the US really generals and vehicles played a huge role in quelling that uprising. And the tradition continued, really what I see is continuity. So part of this militarization of U.S. policy towards Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa is supported by diplomatic image building in Western capitals for the regime in Finfinne. So the diplomatic images ranged from calling the most brutal dictator, Haile Selassie, in Time magazine in 1936, Man of the Year. And American evangelists fulminated from pulpits saying that Ethiopia is the land of our heritage during the Italian occupation. And this has become part of the mainstream psyche of the white and black America. So we're dealing with this at image level of the Ethiopian intervention, the US intervention in Ethiopia. Recently, just as recently as I think July 24, 2013, Deputy Defense Secretary Ash Carter meets with General Samoura Yunus, Chief of Staff, basically emphasizing how the US government and the Ethiopian government are going to continue cooperation on security. So as I have advanced an argument in my writing that I'm going to give you later if you wanted to read the details analysis, is that security takes priority over human rights, democracy, freedom, justice, and what have you. And what the US is doing is giving a lip service, basically fundamentally not holding this government to actionable account or to kind of, 5 minutes? Okay. So I say in the thesis that the anti-terrorism the domestic, this international and the alliance with the North has played, I looked at specifically US interventions, so the history goes way back to Europeans and colonialism and so on. I didn't go into that one. Kadiro probably will. So it kind of encourages domestic structural violence, what Galton called. This violence actually led to the proscription of what were formerly participated, parties that peacefully participated in elections, like the Oromo Liberation Front, the Gimbot 7, they are now proscribed by the Ethiopian government, not by the US government, as terrorist entities, and anybody could be rounded up and jailed just based on rumors. So this has been used, as Dr. Muhammad Hassan also says elsewhere, as an instrument for consolidating EPR and TPLF power or hegemony. By the silence, it's used, especially the war on terrorism has been used to buy the silence of the United States and other Western governments on flagrant, massive human rights violations that border or are even genocide or genocidal in nature compared to other conflicts in the region, like, for example, Darfur, which has recognition. So this silence is wreaking a lot of havoc. So there is so much continuity between what US is doing now and during the Cold War. The only shift that happened is the name of the enemy from communism to terrorism. Of course, I should acknowledge that the US really faced legitimate challenge to its interests in the Horn of Africa. That's obvious. For example, the 1990s embassy bombing and the post-9/11 situation really changed the game. And the Tigrayans the Tigrayan elites have jumped onto the bandwagon of terrorism, although the real terrorists are themselves. So there's further showing that the US policy is militarized. There is AFRICOM implementing and military security operations and training. The Ethiopian army, as you saw, the meeting between the defense secretary and so on, Uh, so there is a vicious cycle of violence that has been going on as a result of U.S. intervention in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. That sort of, if you look at the image, people who are crying, for example, the ethnic cleansing in the eastern part of Oromia right now, Mayu Muluke, or the post-9, the 2000 election violence, 2005, or the 1990s violence before the OLF left. So there's a human rights crisis, a humanitarian crisis, as a result of the US militarizing its policy towards Ethiopia in the name of counterterrorism, and giving really high-tech weapons like night vision goggles and AC-130 fighter helicopter gunships, Humvees. I have no evidence that these are used in the domestic conflict. I only know that the potential for the TPLF to use it, if it grows desperate, is high and uncontrollable. The only way you can control it is by not giving them military support. So here, I saw Humvees with my own naked eye. Like, in 2005, I was in the capital city. I saw Humvees trying to quell post-election kind of protest. I saw other kinds of weapons that are not really domestic. So what I'm saying here is that these weapons, you don't have leverage over how the regime gets to use it when, for example, rebels push to the capital, when they grow desperate, or things like that. So I'm going to finish it off. My time has run out. So maybe so there's a huge structural violence. A lot of political activists are being imprisoned, especially isolated and targeted from the Ogaden, the Oromo, and others. The intensity is much more on the Oromo and the other people. So this regime has a legitimacy problem enforcing anti-terrorism law because the army and police is over 94% dominated by Tigrayan generals and commanders. So the law is misapplied locally, not to punish real Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda related extremists, but to punish really the opponents of the government in the name of sort of enforcing this draconian law. So I had actually other things that I have here, like, for example, conflict resolution. I come at it from international relations and the conflict resolution perspective, but there is an elaborate description of whether conflict resolution is actually possible or not. But my own argument is, first of all, before you even try conflict resolution or democracy or human rights, you first have to alter what is called power asymmetry. Any struggle that happens in that region has to alter the power asymmetry between the Tigrayan minority and the Oromo majority and the people from the south. Unless power asymmetry is shifted, like it was shifted in South Africa because of widespread campaigns, anti-apartheid campaigns, anti-repression campaigns, unless the power asymmetry is shifted in favor of the majority, do not even dream about human rights and democracy. It's a lip service.
Inuma tikse emaleku lato ashufe batalo ninga abisu. Inuma rafe emaleya lami tokuma dabu namara abisu. Allayan allayuma maltu allayan.
Add a word to Kadiro. Kadiro was introduced in the morning. There is no point in repeating it. In March, I had the good fortune of reading his manuscript, which is about 600 or 700 pages. It took me 2 or 3 days, actually, to go through it, suggest few ideas. He is really a very young, energetic, full of energy. And having someone like him in OSA, like Kaptamu, several other young people, is really very, very promising for our future, for the future of our people. Kadiro, please.
Inumaan tiksee malee kuulatoo ashuufee baddaa loon hin gaabbisu. Inumaan rafee malee yaalamii tokkummaa.
Indagama. Okay. The topic I'm going to present is the United States foreign policy towards Ethiopia during the time of, from the time of Emperor Ieyasu, which is 1913 to the fall of Haile Selassie in 1974. So I'm just going through the diplomatic history of these two relations, as well as the human rights protections of nations and nationalities and incorporated within this entity called Ethiopia. And during the OSA mid-year conference, I presented a paper which says U.S. misguided and short-sighted foreign policy, a challenge for the Oromo struggle. And basically, this is a continuation of that presentation which I presented in Atlanta. So in that presentation, I tried to indicate that the two pillars of the United States foreign policy toward Ethiopia were, one is basically the foreign policy of the United States toward Ethiopia. However, it was, started with a good intention, were informed by racism as number one element. That racism is, some of them are deliberate policy of the United States government at the time, because the time Ethiopia established relationship with United States was actually like 5 years after the passage of equal but segregation law here in United States, where the United States policymakers and the Supreme Court decided that the black people were not equal with the white partners. So those policies were primarily informed by racism, and another dimension of United States foreign policy toward Africa was United States joined an imperialist lust which was controlling Africa's resources. And Ethiopia was the last unclaimed territory by the Western colonial powers. And we know that Menelik, with the support of France and other European countries, defeated Italy in 1896 at the Battle of Adwa. So keep in mind that this presentation is part 2 of that presentation. In the last presentation, I tried to indicate that United States foreign policy was informed, as I said, by myth. This myth also strengthened the already existing racial implications of policies within Ethiopia, because the Ethiopian ruling classes established the rule on the myth that they are superior to the rest of Ethiopian conquered nations. They portrayed themselves to the outsiders and also domestically that they are the children of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, and they are white, and the other people were savage. And the Abyssinian had this burden of civilizing these savage races. And this was actually something which United States took it for granted, because, the United States foreign policy towards the Horn of Africa were influenced by this kind of myth. And I tried to show that in my last presentation, and the United States foreign policy makers say that in order to have an state and a political institution, you are supposed to be a Christian, a Semitic, and a civilized. And by all standards, the Oromos, the Somalis, the Kafas, and the Walaitas were not qualified to form their own independent state. And I want to corroborate this with what happened in 1960 when Haile Selassie asked to be the conquering king of the Northeast Africa, which includes areas like Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, up to Uganda. And actually, this fictional Ethiopian image of 1891 Menelik circular letter, in which the boundary of ancient Ethiopia starts from Khartoum all the way to Nyasaland, which was actually a French design of controlling the Blue and the White Nile. And then the Eisenhower, when Haile Selassie appointed him to be the king of these all areas, he was very much perplexed about who are the people of this region. I presented on my last presentation when Roosevelt was talking about the Horn of Horn of African people, like, oh, the Caucasian Abyssinians, the wonderful people, the empire builders, the people mentioned in the Bible who are just conquering these savage races called the Dankals and the Afars, you know, the Oromos. So Eisenhower has got the same sort of mentality about the Somalis. And then he said, who are Somalis? And then this is on United States National Security Council meeting. There are peoples from the CIA, from the War Department by then, people from White House, the security analysis, whatever bureaus. And then they said, who are Somalis? Are there a jungles in Somalia? Elephants? Lions? What kind of people are they? Are they indigenous? And then, I mean, no one could answer this question. And one guy said he has been to Kenya for hunting, and he saw some Somalis, and he said, perhaps the Somali people in Somalia might look like the people he saw in Kenya. And then the other guy said, oh, I don't know much about Somalia, but I heard that Somalis women are the most beautiful and sexually the most attractive and very capable woman in Africa. And then Eisenhower said, I just said, and then he said, like, if they are a native, why they are obsessed to form their own state? How can they rule themselves? This is what President Eisenhower in 1959 said. And then he said, if we are going to let them rule themselves, they are going to fail. And this, I can demonstrate this from my experience of the Philippines, he said. And then finally, when, I mean, most African countries started to get independence in 1960, United States could not help doing anything else. They have to be on board recognizing independent African states. So United States recognized the independence of Somalia because Great Britain and Italy at the time insisted for the independence of Somalia. Otherwise, it's going to just conflagrate. I mean, the conflict is going to take over the entire region of Horn of Africa. So basically, what I'm trying to say here is the United States foreign policy toward that part of Africa were influenced by a myth. The myths which were fabricated outside. And this continued until 1973 when Haile Selassie was about to fall. When Haile Selassie rule was shaken by regional turbulences and the wall of famine, as well as the student rebellions in 1973, he just came over to United States to get a support for his rule. And he had a conversation with Nixon. Haile Selassie was just about to fall, his rule about to collapse. And Nixon said this about his rule. Nixon was talking rather about mental intellect and the wisdom of Haile Selassie. He said, I can't think of the fact that His Majesty is, of course, is a descendant of Solomon. If I can recall the biblical phrase correctly, when King David died and the Lord asked Solomon what he wanted most, Solomon said, Lord, give me an understanding heart. And because he asked for that, he received a great wisdom, a long life, and of course, he had an understanding heart. He has a wisdom, he has a long life, and he has an understanding heart. This was actually the time when Haile Selassie has got like 2 or 3 months to fall down. And United States, even at the time of the crisis in Ethiopia, when the guy that supported for like half a century was challenged, was not willing to change or to consider its policies on the Horn of Africa, and in particular in Ethiopia. So having said that, let me just go back to United States foreign policy during the time of Legiyasu. And Legiyasu was actually one of the most brilliant emperors Abyssinia had, and who tried to reform Abyssinia. He tried to introduce a land reform. He repealed the draconian taxation system of Menelik. He also repealed the Quranya, the labor share system, which is actually some of the core element of Abyssinian justice system. And he tried to introduce the equality of religions in that empire. So when he tried to introduce this, the British and the Italy and the French rejected his policies, saying that we only recognize a Christian Abyssinia, not a Mohammedan Abyssinia. This is what the Minister of Great Britain wrote to London from Addis Ababa. And then he approached, by then, the United States. And he has established a wonderful communication with a United diplomat at this time who is called John Q. Wood. And when he approached him, this is the response of the United States diplomat to the request of Iyasu, who wanted to get support for his reforms. He said, the present government is the worst travesty ever inflicted upon a people. The government exists only name and the worst types of plunderers that any government ever had. The prince is a boy of 18 years. He is a debauchee, sensual, syphilitic, ignorant, without any idea of his duties. A mere tool at the present time, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the most unscrupulous, lying, blackguard, other officials are of the same character, are only not quite so clever. They are dishonest, unreliable, immoral, unprincipled, and surrounded by ignorant groups. And this is basically the perception of the United States towards that country, even when a Christian guy, a Christian emperor, tries to reform that country, they refuse to throw the support behind him, believing that the Christian the Christian group has to maintain its control over Ethiopia, because Ethiopia is mentioned in a Bible in such a way that the Christian identity of the court should be maintained by the support of the Western Christian groups. And when they started to support Haile Selassie, at the time, United States knew that he has this obsession with a power accumulation. If you just go through the United States diplomatic files of 1920s, but the United States supported him with all necessary diplomatic and financial and military supply in 1920s and 1930s. And at the time, the United States diplomat and the people who went to the country were openly reporting that Haile Selassie was making a big fortune out of the slave trade and the slavery. And United States did not take a single action, even to criticize the government of Ethiopia to stop trading in human beings. So that is the legacy of the United States foreign policy towards Ethiopia. And the funny thing is, whosoever got a power, when you have a power, United States foreign policy had this shift of supporting somebody who is in control. The United States foreign policy towards Ethiopia was informed by strangers. If Oromos are strong today, I will promise 100% that United States going to ally with somebody who is capable and willing to protect their interests. Because when Mussolini was about to occupy that country, the diplomatic groups made an assessment and said, okay, Mussolini, please just go and control the capital city as quickly as you can. Stabilize, the capital city, just like they endorsed TPLF in 1991 to control Addis Ababa. So basically, as Habtamu mentioned, the United States foreign policy were informed by this, but it became a policy framework was formulated in 1950s. And that foreign policy was based upon the rivalry between the communists and the capitalistic group on one hand. At the same time, there was this United States radio station operated from Eritrea, and there was an Arab nationalism of Nasser, and there was a formation of the state of Palestine. And this Christian entity, Ethiopia, happens to be a very important asset for United States foreign policy on the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. So now it became a priority of United States to support Ethiopia, which her diplomat described it as a fascist. A United States minister in Addis Ababa, in Finfinne, called the Haile Selassie government a looter, a fascist, incapable, inefficient, exploitative, corrupt, go-getters, embarrassing, repressive, unchangeable, incompetent. these were the adjectives used by different US ministers at different times to describe Haile Selassie. But the United States' overwhelming policy toward that country was just to support anybody who is maintaining the power so that stability would prevail and United States interests would be protected in the region in a struggle against the communist group. So in overall, United States provided like 279 million military support to Ethiopia until the fall of Haile Selassie, and provided Ethiopia purchased like $80 million weapon, as well as 532 million loan from United States. And the economic support was worth over 1 billion. And Ethiopia spent a third of its income, which 95% of them came from the levy from the conquered areas spent on the military spending. So United States also trained like 39,000 Ethiopian military cadets. So the support United States provided for the regime, for the most violent regime, which it is diplomat called like a fascist, while United States was fighting fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany, shows the extent to which United States foreign policy lacked a human rights content. When, United States diplomat asked the State Department about Haile Selassie's use of these weapons, the United States the State Department replied that this is the money we are giving Ethiopia for her service, and Haile Selassie can just claim it the way he like, and can use it the way he like. And the word he said is, if he need it in the form of a golden Cadillac, a car, we can give him in such a way. It is not the responsibility of the United States government to control the means for which he employed those weapons. And so there was no any kind of responsibility and accountability attached to the weapons and the deadly weapons given to Haile Selassie. So to conclude, always the United States foreign policy supported a winner, and there is no human rights content in its policy, and there is no attempt from the part of the United States to understand the content of Ethiopia, the component, the nations and the nationalities, and the people who are oppressed and their needs. When Oromos started the struggle against, for example, somebody was trying to talk this morning about Machat Ulama, and other guy was talking about the Bale Rebellion, and United States diplomat described the Bale Rebellion like a band of Arusi Gala with only a vague ideological or with no political aims, simply the sycophant of Somalia. So these were a kind of descriptions that were just giving the Oromo resistance. And I should have to say that there are some policies which United States carried out in Horn of Africa with earnest intent, like the 4 points that Habtamo mentioned, developmental policies and the educational support. But these were compromised because it was grafted on the corrupted policies of the empire, which increases the predatory as well as the exploitative nature of the ruling class. Because whatever the United States tried to employ, trying to change that country, came through Haile Selassie, and it has to go through his bureaucracy and institution, which in a way perpetuate the fundamental inequalities between nations and nationalities of the Horn of Africa. So this is the trend of United States foreign policy, and Dr. Mohammed is showing me that my time is up, and I have a lot to say, but most of the issues I am trying to discuss here are included in my book, and maybe I will be discussing more of them if you are just posing or asking me a question relating to United States foreign policy towards Ethiopia and the nations and nationalities and people in the region. Thank you very much for your attention.